Hi everybody, I'm Tim from troutandfeather.com, and in this fly tying tutorial we're going to talk about the essential materials you need to tie mayfly nymphs part 2. Stay tuned. The first thing that I want to mention is that this is part 2 in a 2-part series related to purchasing mayfly nymph materials. If you haven't previously watched part 1, I'll try to put a link somewhere on the screen right now, but you can always view the description of this video and there will be a link down there that will guide you to part 1, which I definitely recommend watching before this one. To kind of bring everybody up to speed from part 1, during that video I talked about the notion of buying materials and how that's a really overwhelming task for those people, especially newbies in the world of fly tying. Instead of me just simply saying, hey, if you buy these 12 materials, you'll be fine, I wanted to narrow it down a little bit. And at that point, I decided to basically go down the avenue of recommending materials for mayfly nymphs. During that first video, I talked briefly about mayfly nymphs. I talked a little bit about their entomology. I drew a really horrendous picture on my iPad, and please don't go back just to look at that picture, just to really give an overview of what the nymph looks like. And then I started talking about some of the materials that I would recommend. We're talking about hooks, I think I talked about tailing fibers, and a few other areas. And now this is the second part in the concluding video in that series. During this video, I'm again going to be making some recommendations about materials that I think that you should purchase. And I'm going to again break this down into 2 tiers. I'm first going to talk about materials that I think you absolutely must have. So there'll be that tier 1 type of material. Then I'm going to take it a little bit further into this tier 2. And those materials are those that you can probably use on a regular basis, but if you're just getting into fly tying, you don't have to just throw your money towards those as an investment. Instead, you can basically accumulate those on an as-needed basis. So really try to think about that tier 1 versus tier 2 type of materials. I do want to point out that all of the materials that I mentioned during this video will be listed in the description of this video. And most importantly, I want to point out that please check out the comments section of this video, because as with the last one, I guarantee that I'm going to miss something. I'm sure there's going to be a material or 2 out there that you're sitting back thinking, geez, why didn't he say that? And it could be for a number of reasons. Number 1, I may not use that material. Or number 2, it may be a material that I quite simply forgot. In the part 1, there was one material that I did not mention, and it was basically gold ribbing. I talked about gold wire, but I didn't talk about gold tinsel. And Sean Mooney quickly picked up on that and said, Tim, how can you tie the gold ribbed hare's ear without gold ribbing? And I quickly responded to him and saying, you know what, I honestly don't use that much gold ribbing. I don't use tinsel on a regular basis, so it was tough for me to recommend that. However, I know many tires that do. So Sean, great catch on that first video, and hopefully you kind of point out something else that I am undoubtedly going to miss in this one. So with that said, I don't want to really waste any more time. I'm going to immediately just kind of pick up where I left off in part 1, and we're going to go through a few more materials that recommend to mayfly nymphs. Well, we're going to work our way from the tail up to the head of the mayfly nymph. So let's start this off with our first category, tailing fibers. This is a really easy one for me to make recommendations for. And let's start with 2 tier 1 materials. The first is going to be pheasant tail fibers, and the second is going to be an entire Hungarian partridge, basically a Hungarian partridge skin. Let's talk about each of these, and then I'll get into tier 2. For starters, pheasant tail fibers are just one of those things you have to have. There is no question about it. Whenever I think about Baetis nymphs and PMD nymphs, a vast majority of those that are in my fly box are tied with pheasant tail fibers for the tailing material. Now keep in mind, not all pheasant tail fibers are created equal. And I know that because I'm a pheasant hunter, and whenever I take these tails off a lot of the pheasants, they have different colorations and different things going on. For instance, the one in my right hand is just a shade darker than the one in my left hand. So whenever you go to purchase these, you really have to kind of focus on that and focus on a couple other things. You want to make sure that all the tips come to a point, or as many as possible. We're talking about 95% of the entire tail. And then also, whenever you're looking at it, you want to see if you can make sure that this, we'll say it goes from this golden color to a black color, but you want to make sure that black barring will really stay solid as far out as possible. The more that stays solid further out on the fiber, and I'm talking further away from the stem, the better the fiber is in my opinion, because it really can take on some more characteristics, especially if you choose to use this fiber as a body material too. But this is an easy recommendation. Go out and get some. There are many different colors of pheasant tails. I've purchased red, I've purchased olives. I love all those other ones, but at the end of the day, I always come back to the natural color. The second material, which just fell, is a Hungarian partridge skin. And there are so many incredible feathers that are found on this. I can't tell you how many skins I have, how many I've gone through, but without a doubt, one of the best fibers that's used on these, one of the best feathers, come around this breast area. And they are these little mottled feathers. They have this really great barring to them, and they just look incredible. You can use them as tailing fibers, you can use them as leg material, you can use them for soft hackles. There are so many uses on this entire skin, but I really love using these for tailing fibers on a few mayfly nymphs. So keep that in mind, and I'm making that recommendation of this, not just for mayfly nymph tailing fibers, but basically the entire atmosphere of mayfly nymphs and nymphs in general. Now let's jump into tier 2, and there's a couple different fibers I want to talk about, and some more prevalent than others. The first one is going to be mallard and wood duck flank feathers. These are really great feathers. They're very traditional. What's nice about them, they have, again, a barring to them, which to me really takes on that representation of insect life. They are beautiful feathers. You can use them for a lot of other things. Whenever I first got into fly tying, I felt like you had to be using wood duck and mallard flank on your flies. Did you have to be? No, absolutely not, but it was something that I just noticed in so many of those books that I first started reading. As I've really developed more into fly tying, I find myself using less and less of this fiber. However, it's one that if you look in a lot of fly tying bins, you're going to see this fiber on a lot of flies that are out there. So I don't want to discourage you from purchasing them because I'm not using them personally. I know many others are. So keep that in mind. They make really beautiful tailing fibers. You can also use them for legs. There's lots of different parts of a fly that you can use these fibers on. If you know someone that hunts ducks, definitely talk to them. I always like to give a shout out to my dad's best friend, Kirk. Kirk, thank you for getting me all of these flank feathers. And finally, one that is easily moving up my list of that kind of I'll say tier 1.5 are going to be these Coq de Leon fibers, also referred to as CDL. These are really unique. They have a great mottled look to them. I'll show you this kind of from the back. You can see all that barring that goes through them. But what's incredible about these fibers is that they are very resilient. They're very durable, unlike pheasant tail fibers. On a lot of my pheasant tail nymphs that I use, the tails will break off, and for some reason, in my opinion anyway, they just don't seem to be as effective whenever those tailing fibers have broken off. Thus, a lot of people have gone to using these Coq de Leon fibers to use in place of the pheasant tail because they really won't tear off. They're a very resilient feather. I'm using these more and more often on a regular basis. A lot of people ask me what colors I recommend. I tend to use either the medium or the dark pardo. And what's great about these Coq de Leon fibers is that you can also use them on dry flies for tailing too. So keep that in mind. They're a little pricey, but without a doubt, worth it. So those are some tailing materials that I'd like to recommend, both tier 1, tier 2, and kind of tier 1.5. Let's move on to the next category. Moving forward from the Mayfly nymph tailing fibers, let's transition into body materials. And I'll be completely honest with all of you and admit that this was probably the most nerve-wracking part of this video because I had to take all the Mayfly nymph body materials that are out there, and there are a ton, and narrow it down to a manageable list. When I went through my own personal fly tying collection, I was pretty much overwhelmed with all of those that I have, and I use quite a bit of them, so I have to kind of throw that out there. But the intent of this video is to really narrow it down into a manageable number, and that's what I intend to do. Before I go over my recommended materials, I absolutely have to mention that after watching this section, if there's a material you believe I missed, please mention it in the comments section below, because I know there are definitely materials out there that you probably use on a regular basis and you're wondering why I'm not. So again, like I mentioned earlier, I may have forgotten, but more than likely, these are the ones that I turn to on a regular basis, and they may be different than those that you're using. And you also, don't be afraid to mention some of the colors that you turn to. You're going to see that in a lot of my Mayfly nymph body materials, I don't use a lot of sparkle on those nymphs. It's something that I really don't look for in the body fibers, though I will use a bead head, or I'll use ribbing, and I'll use some sparkle in other ways, but you won't see a lot of that in these materials, but that's again my personal preference. So with that said, let's get started with those tier 1, the absolute recommended must-haves. Well, the first one is one that I talked about in the part 1 video, and that's fly tying thread. An easy way to build up a really slender body is to simply use your fly tying thread if that color matches the insect that you're trying to imitate. So whenever I think back to those fly tying threads that we tie with, the colors that I would be using on a regular basis to make a Mayfly nymph body are going to be black, brown, a lighter color like a tan or a cream, and then an olive. You start with those 4 and you have a really good base, and it's really simple to just build up a smooth tapered body and then just rib it with some gold wire ribbing. That's a great way to just quickly just crank out some Mayfly nymphs that will catch fish. Now let's move into the dubbing realm. And there's a brand of dubbing out there that I use on a regular basis that I absolutely love. It's called SLF Spiky Squirrel Dubbing. This stuff is just incredible. I love it. I'm not saying that fish just gravitate towards it, but whenever I use it, it just looks buggy on that hook. Now, I also use this on a lot of my caddis patterns, so keep that in mind as well. But there are a ton of colors out there. I think there's around 15, 17 colors out there of this SLF Spiky Squirrel Dubbing. But I can narrow my list down to about 4, and here are the 4 that I use on a regular basis. One is natural fox, another's brown, one's black, and the last one is olive. So I would shoot for these 4 and then add others on an as-needed basis. I'll be honest with you, I have every color out there that they make, but these are the 4 that I'm going to be using on a regular basis to imitate nymphs in the areas that I fish. Now let's talk about a couple more materials. Let's get back to that tailing fiber, the pheasant fibers. Let's pull these pheasant tails back out, because what's great about them, after you've tied them in and you're using them as a tailing fiber, you can take the excess portion, basically the remaining portion from your tie-in point to the butt of the fiber, and simply wind it around the hook, and it makes a fly called the pheasant tail nymph. Easily one of my go-to nymphs. Now, as I mentioned during the tailing section, I've been using Coq de Leon quite a bit, so a lot of my nymphs now will have a Coq de Leon tail and then pheasant tail for the body material. But pheasant tails are absolutely just that one go-to that I have. Kind of jumping between tier 1 and tier 2, I do like having some olive pheasant tails for the body. So kind of keep that in mind. I wouldn't necessarily have to use an olive for the tailing fiber, but I do occasionally use olive whenever I'm tying blooming olives, and I want to use that olive fiber for the body. And then finally, one more material that I recommend in tier 1 is a simple hare's mask. This is something that you use on so many different flies out there, not just Mayfly nymphs, but it's a great thing to have. It's a great color, that natural hare's mask. I can't tell you how many of these I've used over the years, but I love them. Now let's move into the tier 2 of materials for the body. And this is where it gets a little bit different. Now by different, let's just kind of go back to that hare's mask. I love hare's masks, but I like them also in the color olive. Can you get by with that SLF olive and not have to use this? Absolutely. Is it nice to also have some rabbit fur out there? By all means. So this is the one color that I would recommend that's out of that tier 1. And now next, for my last recommendation, I have been using lately just an absolute ton of turkey biots for the body. If you think back to the drawing that I made in video 1, we talked about the notion of these Mayfly nymphs having very slender, segmented bodies. And you can accomplish that with these turkey biots, and they look absolutely realistic. Now, I'm not one of those fly tiers that ties a fly and I want it to look exactly like its imitation or that natural insect. But these really give it that insect ability, that just great look to them that capture not only fly fishermen, but also the fish. So if you have not started experimenting with turkey biots, this is something that I would absolutely recommend you experiment. You can try tying them in a number of different ways, but at the end of the day, they look awesome on your flies, both dry flies and on Mayfly nymphs. Now the colors that I go to, gosh, I have them all. But again, I try to refine my list. So let's go with black, let's go with brown, let's go with a lighter color like a tan or a cream, and then finally, let's go with olive. So you start off with those ones, and I think you're gonna have all of your bases covered. Let me look at my notes real quick, and I believe that's it for my Mayfly nymph body materials. So those are the ones that I use easily on a regular basis to represent those Mayfly nymphs out there. And if you have any suggestions to add, by all means, please do so in the comments section below. After finishing the body of the Mayfly nymph, the next area that I tend to focus on is going to be the wing case. And this is one that I'm not going to stress too much over. In fact, there's only one item that I have as a recommendation in Tier 1, and that's a natural turkey tail feather. These are just an incredible thing to have at your fly tying desk. There's really nothing negative I can say about them. They have beautiful coloration. They're adorable fiber. They look just natural. By all means, go out there and get some of these. Or if you know someone that hunts turkeys, then hit them up. My buddy Don is a great turkey hunter. Don, thank you for keeping these, or keeping my collection well stocked. Whenever you're tying this in, there's a couple different ways that I tend to see, or we'll say a couple different places. Sometimes individual tyers will tie these so that case extends the whole way from the tail basically up over the thorax, and in some instances it's just over the thorax. So it really depends based on the type of insect that you're trying to represent. But if there's one item that I'm going to say, hey, go out there and get this one, it's a no-brainer. It's these turkey tail feathers. For Tier 2, we're going to look at two synthetics. The first one is a product called Thin Skin. This is the packaging for it. You can't really see mine because as soon as I purchase this stuff, I just cut it into a bunch of strips. So I'm always ready to, I basically always have them cut so I can just tie them in, plop them over the thorax, tie them off, trim them, and be done with it. Whenever I'm thinking about, again, trying to narrow that list down as much as possible, there's really only a couple different colors that I ever use. And basically, whenever you look at the modeling on the outside, the two that I tend to gravitate towards are the mottled bustard or the mottled oak, and the color is natural. I have some of the other colors, but at the end of the day, those are the two that I'm most often using. And then finally, one more synthetic material. And if I'm going for a little bit more flash, this is when I'm going to pull out something just that will really, we'll say, catch the fish's attention. And this is a product from UNI Products, and it's called UNI Mylar. The color is holographic silver, and the size is number 12. It also says 3/64 of an inch on it. And this is one of those materials that, depending on how you're looking at it, it just gives off different colors. So this is something that you can easily tie in as the wing case. It will prop things apart, but you can also put a little bit of UV glue on top of it to really just make it pop. So those are the three products that I recommend for wing cases. Don't overthink them, but I guarantee there's probably some others that you're using out there. So if there's something you'd like to mention, then again, as I've said so many times, definitely do so in the comments section of this video. For the insect legs of a Mayfly nymph, again, we're going to try to keep this as simple as possible. If you took my earlier recommendation, whenever I was talking about tailing fibers, I mentioned a Hungarian partridge skin. Well, let's come back to these fibers. These are without a doubt that one material that I say, hey, you have to have these. These Hungarian partridge feathers are just, they're the feather that you want to use. They have some just great modeling, though they tend to be a little bit light in color at times. So whenever you purchase the entire skin, you'll notice that there's some other great colors on this, some darker, some lighter, that you can also use for the Mayfly nymph legs. So kind of keep all that stuff in mind. This is just something that you gotta have. This would be Tier 1. Whenever I think about Tier 2, I absolutely love to recommend hen necks. They are just wonderful to have. They're not overly expensive, and once you accumulate a few of them, you pretty much have everything that you need to accommodate most of your tying needs. Now, there's a few colors out there that I really just prefer over all others. One, I just call this color natural, and it's basically like a lighter shade of brown. I don't want this overly brown, though I have those dark browns and those blacks, but this natural brown really just seems to be a great color for Mayfly insect legs. Next, the other two colors that I like to encourage others to purchase would be an olive and also a grizzly. And that grizzly now kind of relates back to that Hungarian partridge. So whenever we're thinking about the legs, whenever we're tying these in, I really prefer those natural materials, and I try to keep it as simple as possible. Let's next discuss the thorax of Mayfly nymphs. And this is where I definitely need a little bit of help from you, because in my mind, it's peacock herl or something that looks like peacock herl, and that's it. Whenever I look through my box, that is pretty much what makes up around 90% of my Mayfly nymphs. So it's tough for me to recommend anything else. So if there's something that you're using that maybe I'm missing out on, please let me know. Mention it in the comments section below, because I want to hear what else people are using out there. It might be just a certain color of dubbing to represent a specific Mayfly, but I'd love to hear from all of you regarding that. For me, it's quite simple. I have my tier 1, and that's going to be peacock herl. This is just one of those must-have materials in fly tying. You can use this on so many different types of flies. Dry flies, wet flies, nymphs, streamers. You name it, you can probably put this on that fly and have success with it. And I absolutely believe that statement. Now, a couple things that I want to mention regarding peacock. It's not the most resilient fiber, so you may have to consider reinforcing it if you're tying it on, especially over a longer area. The other great thing about it, though, is that it just has this wonderful coloration to it. It can kind of change colors depending on which way you're looking. Sometimes I'll tie in 1 or 2 fibers, sometimes 3 or 4 fibers if I really want to bulk up that area. But peacock herl is something you just absolutely have to have. If you can purchase it in person, make sure you look through it. Try to get as full as fibers as possible. But gosh, go out there and buy this. Now next I'm going to talk a little bit about dubbing related to peacock, because it's peacock herl and everything else. I've earlier put out a video, and I'll put it down in the description of this video, and it was just related to peacock dubbing and the notion that you can buy peacock dubbing and it says it's peacock colored. However, not all of those are created equal. And I would really just like to mention that video that I made a couple years ago. I'll again kind of direct you to it. The link's in the description of this video, just to know that they're not all the same. Some dub easier than others. They have absolutely different colors the whole way from light to dark, regardless of what they say on the label. So if you're thinking about purchasing some peacock dubbings, really kind of see what's out there and try to narrow down your list. The one that I'm going to recommend as the tier 2 recommendation is a simple one. This is one that I got from frostyfly.com. It's a product from Hemingway's, and it's called Peacock Dubbing in the 12 most popular colors. So if I just show you this, you can see it goes from dark to light. So pretty much anything you're going to need, you're going to have in this little assortment here. Again, this is a great tier 2 purchase. I think I mentioned frostyfly.com, great place to get it from. I try to make that one as simple as possible too. Now let's try to wrap up this video. I believe there's one more area we're going to discuss before my final thoughts. This is the last area of recommendations, and the topic is going to be hotspots. Now, hotspots is not necessarily an area of a Mayfly nymph, but this is just something that we're going to use to possibly attract fish. Whenever I think about hotspots, I'm basically thinking about fluorescent colors that I'm using in one of pretty much 2 instances. If I'm fishing over really pressured fish and I want to do something that will kind of set my fly apart, or if I'm fishing in water that might be a little discolored and I want to make sure that the fish are able to see the pattern. So kind of put that in the back of our brains that we're talking about those types of hot spots, and they can be tied on at any point on the fly. We're talking below the tail, directly in front of the tail, as the body, as the thorax, as a bead at the front, as just simple thread at the front. So we have lots of different options in regards to placement as well. Now, whenever I think about hotspots, this isn't something that I have on every single one of my patterns, but I definitely have quite a few patterns with hotspots in my boxes. And I'll talk about pretty much the 4 most common examples and materials that I would recommend related to this. Though in my mind, these are all tier 2 materials, so please keep that in mind. The first one is really an easy one, and it's when we just take some type of fly tying thread that's a fluorescent color. And I'm going to basically use chartreuse and pink as those two colors that I use most often. And after we've finished the Mayfly nymph, we've tied it off, everything's done, we put head cement, or we haven't put head cement yet. We've just left a little area, maybe directly behind the bead. That's where I'm just going to grab some chartreuse thread and just put 5 or 6 or 10 wraps on it and immediately tie it off and put some head cement there. Very simple, just to put a little bit of thread as a hot spot. Again, pink, chartreuse, fluorescent colors. You can also do that directly in front of the tail. Maybe you tie in your tailing fibers, then you just put a little tag of chartreuse or pink thread, and then you finish the rest of the fly. But it's just that something unique to set that fly apart. The next thing that I recommend is a type of thread. I love uni thread whenever we're talking about just that 6/0, that 8/0, those basic threads. But there's also a company out there called Glo-Brite, spelled Glo-Brite, that just has these incredible colors that really just seem to glow a little bit more than others. It's tough to explain until you've used it. It's more like a yarn in a sense, though. It ties just like a thread. I use my regular bobbins with this. And again, the colors that I like in Glo-Brite, just like UNI products, are fluorescent pink and chartreuse. Next, something different is the notion of a flashback. And we kind of talked about that a little bit ago whenever we were discussing wing cases, and that was whenever we talked about a UNI product called Mylar. And using that UNI Mylar is something that kind of changes it up a little bit, because we're now adding that flash to the fly, and in my opinion, we're basically creating a hot spot. Now, when I call it flashback, we use that flashback term because whenever you look at the fly from the top, it looks like it has a flashy back. So this is really not complicated by any means. But something that we can do to really bring that flashiness out is to put a little bit of UV glue over the top of it, hit it with a UV light, and it really just seems to make that thing shine. I love pheasant tail flashback nymphs. They are a great Mayfly nymph to use. And then finally, the last hotspot material that I'd like to bring to your attention is simply thinking about tying a bead head, but using a fluorescent colored bead in place of that brass or gold or black bead that you're using. Instead, try to put something else out there that really will just change it up a little bit. Now, there are areas in which I've fished hotspots and had very little success. There's areas that whenever I go there, I'm going to be putting a hotspot on every single time. And that's something you have to kind of feel out and learn. It's not a really steep learning curve by any means, but hotspots are something unique, and they're really just something to set your fly out apart. So by all means, keep that in mind whenever you're tying not just Mayfly nymphs, but all nymphs in general. Well, we are now coming to an end in part 2 of this 2-part series on purchasing Mayfly nymph materials. I have to be honest and tell you that I've had a lot of fun making these videos, though they have been time consuming and they've really required me to think a lot about all the materials that I use on a regular basis and really narrow it down into a manageable list to recommend to all of you. And I really took that very serious, and all these recommended materials that I'm mentioning, I absolutely use on a regular basis, and I want all of you to know that. Now, with that said, as I've mentioned probably too many times, if there's a material that I missed, please, by all means, mention it down in the comments section, just so we can make those other materials available, or at least make others aware that there are other materials that people are using. Now, if you have any questions or comments regarding anything that I mentioned in this video, you can leave those in the comments section, or you can email me at tcammisa@gmail.com. If you're looking for the entire list of everything that I recommended throughout this video, just check out the description of this video, and there you'll find that list and some of the links that I've also referenced. Well, if you're looking for more YouTube fly tying and fly fishing videos, I definitely encourage you to check out my website, which is troutandfeather.com. I also have a Facebook page, and if you like that, you'll receive regular fly tying and fly fishing updates as I post them. Well, once again, thank you so much for viewing these 2 videos. Again, hopefully it showed that I had a lot of fun making them, and I hope you can use these recommendations to either build or enhance your personal fly tying collection. Thanks, everybody.